The story of World War II that most people carry around in their heads is a story that was built afterward. It was assembled from press releases, censored newsreels, official military histories, and the deliberate decisions of governments on every side to determine what their populations would be allowed to know. The version that survived, the version taught in classrooms and reproduced in documentaries, tends to organize the war into a shape that human beings find tolerable. There are aggressors and defenders. There are crimes and there are responses to crimes. There is a beginning defined by invasion and an end defined by surrender. And somewhere between those 2 points, a conclusion is implied, a moral resolution, a sense that the correct side prevailed and that prevailing meant something. That version is not false in every detail, but it is incomplete in ways that matter, and the incompleteness is not accidental. What actually happened between 1939 and 1945 was something more complicated, more bureaucratic, and in many ways more disturbing than the simplified narrative allows. The war was not simply a conflict between good and evil. It was a conflict between states, and states operate through systems. Those systems had procedures. Those procedures were followed. And when the procedures required that human beings be processed, transferred, executed, starved, experimented upon, or erased from official records, the procedures were still followed. The paperwork was still filed. The forms were still stamped. That is what this account is about. Not the heroism, not the liberation, not the speeches and the monuments. This is about how the war actually functioned at the level of institutions, decisions, routines, and deliberate silences. It is about what was hidden, what was known, what was chosen, and what was quietly allowed to continue because allowing it to continue served a purpose. The first thing to understand is that censorship during World War II was not a measure imposed in moments of panic. It was a planned, systematic infrastructure that existed in every major combatant nation before the fighting even began in earnest. The United States Office of Censorship was established in December 1941, within days of Pearl Harbor, and at its peak employed more than 10,000 people. Its mandate was not merely to prevent military secrets from reaching the enemy. Its mandate, though not always stated in those terms, was to manage the emotional and psychological relationship between the American public and the war that was being fought in their name. The distinction matters. Preventing enemy intelligence from learning the position of a naval fleet is a legitimate wartime security measure. Preventing the American public from seeing photographs of dead American soldiers is something different. It is the management of consent. It is a decision made by officials that the population cannot be trusted to continue supporting the war if they are shown its actual cost. For the first year and a half of American involvement in the war, photographs of dead American servicemen were banned from publication entirely. The public saw a war of movement, machinery, and determined faces. They did not see what artillery does to a human body. They did not see the beaches after the beaches were taken. The Office of War Information made these decisions deliberately, based on research into public morale and assessments of what images might cause support for the war effort to waver. When the policy changed in 1943, when the government decided to allow a carefully limited selection of images of American war dead to be published, it was not because officials had reconsidered the ethics of the original policy. It was because polling data indicated that the American public had become too comfortable. War bond purchases were declining. Recruitment enthusiasm was softening. The government's own researchers concluded that the population needed to be reminded that the war involved real death, because complacency was becoming a logistical problem. The dead were released into the public sphere as a tool of mobilization. Their deaths were instrumentalized twice. Once on the battlefield, and once in the decision about whether and when their deaths would be shown to the people back home. Britain operated a similar apparatus under the Ministry of Information, which coordinated with newspaper editors, film studios, and the BBC to shape what the British public understood about the progress of the war. The ministry did not operate primarily through direct orders and prohibitions, though those tools existed. It operated primarily through relationships, through regular meetings with editors, through the cultivation of a shared understanding between the press and the government that certain kinds of reporting would be unhelpful. The phrase used was often that something would be bad for morale. In practice, it meant that information which complicated the official narrative would not appear. The Soviet Union's approach was more direct and considerably more severe. Soviet newspapers reported only what the state chose to report, and what the state chose to report bore a relationship to battlefield reality that was flexible to the point of complete disconnection. During the catastrophic early months of the German invasion, when the Wehrmacht was advancing hundreds of miles per week and encircling entire Soviet army groups, Soviet newspapers described orderly defensive maneuvers and successful counterattacks. The scale of the losses, which were genuinely staggering, was withheld not only from the Soviet public, but from most Soviet officials. Stalin received accurate casualty figures. Almost no one else did. The gap between what was happening and what was reported was so large that Soviet soldiers who had survived encirclement and managed to return to Soviet lines were sometimes treated as suspects because their accounts of what had happened contradicted the official version. Germany's propaganda apparatus under Joseph Goebbels was the most studied and in many ways the most technically sophisticated of the war. What is less often examined is the degree to which the German public was not simply deceived, but was an active participant in a kind of collective self-deception. By 1943, when the tide of the war had clearly turned, Goebbels made a calculated decision to tell the German public more of the truth than he had previously been telling them. The speech he gave in February 1943, following the German defeat at Stalingrad, was remarkable for its explicit acknowledgement that Germany faced a long and difficult war. It was also remarkable for the audience response. The crowd in the Berlin Sportpalast roared its approval. The acknowledgement of difficulty was packaged as a call for total commitment, and the crowd received it that way. The German public was not simply a passive recipient of propaganda. It was, in many documented cases, a population that preferred not to know certain things, and that actively organized its perception to avoid knowing them. This dynamic, the active preference for not knowing, was not unique to Germany. It appears in the historical record of every major participant in the war. It appears in the British government's long suppression of detailed information about the civilian casualties caused by the area bombing campaign against German cities. It appears in the American government's post-war decisions about which aspects of the atomic bombings to emphasize and which to allow to fade from the public record. It appears in the Soviet Union's decades-long suppression of information about what happened to Soviet prisoners of war who survived German captivity and were then processed by Soviet security services upon their return. The treatment of Soviet prisoners of war who returned from German camps is one of the least examined major episodes of the entire war. The Soviet Union lost approximately 5.5 million soldiers as prisoners of war to Germany. Of those, approximately 3.5 million died in German captivity, a mortality rate so extreme that it constitutes one of the largest single acts of deliberate mass killing in the war. German policy toward Soviet prisoners was not a passive failure of administration. It was a deliberate decision to provide inadequate food, shelter, and medical care, combined in some cases with direct killing, because German military and ideological doctrine categorized Soviet soldiers as racially and politically subhuman, and therefore outside the protections of the Geneva Convention, which the Soviet Union had not signed. What happened to the approximately 2 million Soviet prisoners who survived German captivity and returned to Soviet territory is a separate and in some ways equally disturbing story. Soviet military doctrine, formalized in Stalin's Order 270 issued in August 1941, defined the act of being taken prisoner as presumptive treason. A Soviet soldier who allowed himself to be captured rather than fighting to the death or killing himself was, under this doctrine, a traitor to the Soviet state. When surviving prisoners began returning to Soviet control, either through prisoner exchanges, liberation by advancing Soviet forces, or the collapse of German prisoner camps as the German army retreated, they were not welcomed. They were processed. They were sent to filtration camps run by the NKVD, the Soviet security apparatus, where they were interrogated, evaluated, and sorted. A significant fraction were executed. A larger fraction were sent to labor camps in the Gulag. Many of those who were eventually released were marked in their internal Soviet documents in ways that permanently affected their ability to find employment, live in major cities, or have their wartime service officially recognized. The men who had survived years of German captivity, who had endured starvation and systematic brutality, returned to their own country and were imprisoned again, not because of anything they had individually done, but because the system required that they be treated as suspect. This was not a secret within the Soviet bureaucracy. It was policy. It was implemented through established procedures. The forms were filled out. The decisions were recorded. The Allied nations were aware, to varying degrees, of what was happening to Soviet prisoners. American and British intelligence had obtained information about the treatment of Soviet returnees. This information was assessed, filed, and not acted upon in any public way, because the political relationship with the Soviet Union was more important than the fate of men whose suffering was occurring within Soviet territory and Soviet jurisdiction. The question of what was known and when it was known runs through virtually every major suppressed reality of the war. It is often framed as a binary, as though the only options are complete knowledge and complete ignorance. The historical record is considerably more uncomfortable than that binary allows. In most cases, partial information was available. In most cases, that partial information was received by officials who then made decisions about how much to pursue, how much to document, and how much to share. The decisions were rarely made in dramatic moments of moral confrontation. They were made in the ordinary flow of administrative work, in meetings and cables and assessments and briefings, by people who had many other things to attend to and who had learned, as one learns in any bureaucratic environment, that certain kinds of information create complications that are difficult to manage. The systematic killing that became known as the Holocaust was not invisible to Allied governments. This requires some care in how it is stated, because the full scale and systematic nature of the industrial killing program was not known with certainty in 1942 and early 1943. But information was available. Reports were reaching the British government as early as 1941 through Polish underground sources, through diplomatic channels, through intelligence assessments, that Jews and other targeted populations in German-occupied territory were being killed in large numbers. The question of what to do with this information, how publicly to acknowledge it, whether to make it a stated war aimed to stop it, was deliberated. The deliberation produced, with some exceptions, a decision to subordinate the information to other priorities. The war had military objectives. Diverting resources or political attention to the specific fate of targeted civilian populations was assessed as unlikely to shorten the war and potentially complicating to the coalition. The information was held. Specific decisions were made not to bomb the rail lines leading to the killing centers, not because the information was unavailable, but because bombing those lines was assessed as a poor use of available air assets. The internal British government discussions about this have been extensively documented by historians working from declassified archives. They are remarkable for their procedural calm. Officials wrote memoranda. Memoranda received responses. Responses were filed. The filing system was meticulous. What the filing system recorded was a series of decisions made in the ordinary language of administrative correspondence that produced a particular outcome. The outcome was not the result of a single dramatic choice. It was the accumulated result of many small choices, each of which, taken individually, could be described in terms of competing priorities and limited resources. The German bureaucratic apparatus that administered the killing program operated on a similar procedural logic from the other direction. The implementation of the Holocaust was not primarily a story of individual sadists given free rein. It was primarily a story of institutional processes. The Wannsee Conference of January 1942, at which senior German officials coordinated the administrative details of what they termed the final solution to the Jewish question, was in many respects a routine administrative meeting. The minutes of the meeting, which survived the war because they were filed in the ordinary way, record officials discussing logistical details, jurisdictional questions about which populations in which occupied territories fell under which administrative authority, questions about the treatment of mixed-race individuals, and the practical challenges of scale. The meeting lasted approximately 90 minutes. Lunch was served afterward. The officials present were not, for the most part, the figures most prominently associated in the popular imagination with the most extreme violence of the regime. They were mid-level administrators, representatives of various ministries and agencies, men whose careers had been built on competence in managing complex organizational problems. The problem they were managing in January 1942 happened to be the coordinated killing of the Jewish population of Europe. They managed it the way they managed other complex organizational problems, with agendas, with minutes, with assigned responsibilities, with follow-up procedures. The historian who perhaps most thoroughly examined this institutional dimension was Hannah Arendt, whose coverage of the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem in 1961 produced observations about what she called the banality of evil that became both celebrated and controversial. Adolf Eichmann, who was responsible for the logistics of deporting Jews to the killing centers, was not, in Arendt's assessment, a monster in any recognizable sense. He was a bureaucrat. He was a man who had found in the Nazi system a career structure, a set of organizational goals, a series of procedural challenges that he was good at solving. He was proud of his efficiency. He organized transportation logistics across multiple national rail systems under wartime conditions, moving large numbers of people to designated destinations on schedule. That the destinations were extermination camps was, in a sense, a parameter of the logistical problem rather than its moral content. He did not, in his own framing, hate the people he was deporting. He administered their deportation. This framing disturbed many people when Arendt presented it, and it continues to disturb. The disturbance is productive. It is disturbing precisely because it requires confronting something that the narrative of monstrous evil makes easier to avoid, which is the question of how ordinary institutional processes, staffed by ordinary people operating within the logic of their roles, produced outcomes of extreme and systematic inhumanity. The medical experiments conducted in German concentration camps are typically presented as the product of deranged individuals, of doctors who had abandoned all medical ethics and were pursuing grotesque personal obsessions under the cover of state authority. This framing is not entirely wrong, but it is incomplete. The experiments were not simply the work of individuals. They were, in many cases, proposed through institutional channels, reviewed by administrative bodies, approved by officials, and in some cases requested by other institutions, including branches of the German military and German pharmaceutical companies, that had specific research questions they wanted answered. The experiments conducted at Dachau by Sigmund Rascher on human subjects, testing the limits of hypothermia and the effectiveness of various resuscitation methods, were conducted in response to requests from the German Air Force, which had a practical interest in understanding what happened to pilots who were downed over cold water and what could be done to save them. The experimental subjects were concentration camp prisoners. The data was collected and compiled in reports that were submitted through normal institutional channels and distributed to recipients who used the data for their own research purposes. The experiments involved the deaths of an estimated 80 to 100 individuals. The reports were filed. The data was used. After the war, the question of whether this data could legitimately be used by non-German scientists and medical researchers became a matter of significant debate. The data existed. It had been obtained through methods that were, from any recognizable ethical standpoint, criminal. Using the data could be framed as extracting some benefit from an unrecoverable harm. Refusing to use it could be framed as the only position consistent with refusing to legitimate the methods by which it was obtained. The debate was not resolved cleanly. In some cases, the data was used. In some cases, it was formally excluded. In some cases, the decision about which category applied was made by individual researchers and institutions rather than through any systematic policy determination. This pattern of knowledge obtained through methods that could not be acknowledged, creating subsequent decisions about what to do with that knowledge, appears repeatedly in the post-war period. It appears in the decisions made by American, British, and Soviet intelligence services about German scientists, engineers, and technical specialists whose expertise had been developed in the context of the Nazi war machine and whose subsequent usefulness to the programs of the victorious powers was substantial. Operation Paperclip, through which the United States Army brought more than 1,600 German scientists and engineers to the United States in the years immediately after the war, is the most documented of these programs, though not the only one. The individuals recruited included figures who had used concentration camp labor in rocket production facilities, where prisoners worked under conditions that killed them in large numbers, and figures who had been members of the SS and other organizations directly implicated in the systematic killing program. The program required the falsification of records in some cases, the deliberate suppression of information about individuals' wartime activities in others, and in virtually all cases, a decision by the officials running the program that the individual's technical expertise outweighed the relevance of their prior conduct. The decision was made at institutional levels. It was reviewed by officials who understood what they were doing. The paperwork reflected the decision. The individuals were brought to the United States, given positions in government research programs and eventually private industry, and in many cases became significant figures in American scientific and technological development. The director of NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center for most of the 1960s was a man who had run the rocket program that used slave labor from the Dora Mittelbau concentration camp. His management of the Saturn V program that put Americans on the moon was regarded as a major achievement. Both things were true simultaneously. The institutional decision had been made that the second truth would not be prominently part of the public record. The Soviet Union ran an equivalent program. Soviet intelligence and military personnel moved through Germany in the final months of the war, and the immediate post-war period, systematically collecting scientific and technical personnel, equipment, documentation, and institutional knowledge from German research facilities. The scale and specific details of the Soviet program were less documented in public records at the time, and have only been partially reconstructed since. What is clear is that the Soviet nuclear, missile, and aviation programs all benefited from German technical expertise and personnel in ways that the Soviet government did not publicly acknowledge. The British ran smaller but structurally similar programs, with equivalent decisions made about the relevance of individuals' wartime records to their subsequent usefulness. The logic was consistent across all three powers. Technical expertise was a form of value that could be separated from the context in which it had been developed. The separation was not morally obvious, it was institutionally convenient. The bombing campaigns of the war present a similar problem, though from a different angle. The Allied strategic bombing campaign against Germany and the American strategic bombing campaign against Japan were presented to the public and were to some degree conducted as military operations directed against military targets, industrial capacity, and the infrastructure that supported the German and Japanese war efforts. This framing was not entirely false. There were genuine military and industrial targets, and they were genuinely attacked. But both campaigns, over the course of the war, evolved into something that their initial doctrinal frameworks did not acknowledge. The British area bombing campaign, which deliberately targeted German cities rather than specific industrial facilities, was developed partly in response to the practical difficulty of conducting precision bombing at night, and partly as a deliberate policy decision to attack the morale of the German civilian population by destroying the urban environments in which German civilians lived and worked. The decision to pursue this policy was made at the level of the British War Cabinet and the Air Ministry. It was debated. It was approved. It was implemented through Bomber Command under Arthur Harris, who pursued it with considerable organizational energy. The campaign killed between 300,000 and 600,000 German civilians. Depending on the methodology used to calculate the figure, it destroyed large portions of virtually every major German city. The firestorm created in Hamburg in July 1943 during Operation Gomorrah killed somewhere between 30 and 40,000 people in a single week and created conditions in which the heat was sufficient to ignite asphalt and to generate winds strong enough to pull people off their feet and into the fire. The firestorm in Dresden in February 1945 occurred when the military situation was such that German defeat was already certain, and the military value of the attack was disputed even within the British command structure at the time. The moral and legal status of the area bombing campaign was a matter of significant internal debate within the British government during the war and of more extensive public debate afterward. What is notable is how this debate was managed institutionally. Harris received consistent official support for his campaign throughout the war. When the war ended, however, the official commemoration of Bomber Command was notably less prominent than the commemoration of other parts of the British war effort. Harris himself received no peerage of the kind typically awarded to commanders of equivalent seniority. The institution had used the campaign, received its results, and then organized its public memory in ways that created some distance between itself and the methods employed. The men who flew the missions were eventually given a dedicated memorial in London, but it took until 2012. The American incendiary bombing campaign against Japanese cities, which preceded the atomic bombings, is less thoroughly integrated into the American public memory of the war than the atomic bombings themselves. Between March and August of 1945, American B-29s conducted incendiary attacks against more than 60 Japanese cities. The most destructive single night of the campaign was the attack on Tokyo on the night of March 9th and 10th, 1945. In which approximately 300 B-29s dropped incendiary bombs on the densely populated residential areas of the city. The resulting fire killed somewhere between 80,000 and 100,000 people in a single night and destroyed approximately 16 square miles of the city. The architect of the campaign, Curtis LeMay, described the choice to target residential areas explicitly in terms of the fact that Japanese industrial production was dispersed into home workshops and small factories throughout residential neighborhoods. This was true. It was also true that the campaign, by targeting residential areas with incendiary weapons, was designed to produce the maximum number of fires and the maximum amount of destruction in densely populated areas. The framing as an attack on dispersed industrial production was accurate in a technical sense, and was also a description of a decision to burn cities. LeMay understood this. In a statement made after the war, he noted, with considerable candor, that if the United States had lost the war, he would have been tried as a war criminal for what he had done. He was describing accurately the relationship between outcome and judgment. The men who conducted the firebombing of Japanese cities were not tried. They were, in several cases, promoted and honored. The relationship between the methods employed and the outcome achieved was assessed by the institutions that employed those methods, and the assessment produced recognition rather than accountability. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki on August 6th and 9th of 1945 have received more public attention and more sustained moral and historical debate than perhaps any other single events of the war. The institutional decision-making that produced them is worth examining in some detail, not because the examination resolves the debate, but because it illustrates how the decision functioned procedurally. The decision to use the atomic bomb was made by Harry Truman and a small group of advisors, including Secretary of War Henry Stimson and Secretary of State James Burns, without a vote of Congress, without public discussion, and without a formal institutional review process that included figures who might have opposed the decision. A scientific advisory panel had been consulted and had concluded that it could not recommend a purely technical demonstration as an alternative to use against a populated target. though several prominent scientists involved in the project dissented from this assessment. The Interim Committee, the small group of officials who provided the primary advisory input to Truman, discussed several possible approaches to using the weapon and settled on its use against a city without prior specific warning. The decision was not made in a vacuum. Intelligence assessments of Japanese willingness to surrender, projections of American casualties in an invasion of the Japanese home islands, political considerations about the Soviet Union's entry into the Pacific War, and assessments of the weapon's potential to shock Japan into a decision it had been unable to reach through the accumulation of conventional military defeats, all factored into the deliberations. What is documented is that the decision was made procedurally through an institutional process by a relatively small group of people operating under conditions of secrecy, and that the outcome of the process was the selection of specific cities with specific populations as the targets for the first use of nuclear weapons. The targeting process for the atomic bombs was itself an institutional exercise. The Target Committee, which met at the Pentagon and in Los Alamos, developed criteria for target selection that included the size of the urban area, the military and industrial significance of the target, the likely weather conditions, and the importance of preserving the target from conventional bombing damage so that the effects of the nuclear weapon could be accurately assessed. The criteria were debated and refined. The final list of targets was developed through a process of elimination and evaluation that was, from an administrative standpoint, methodical. The population of each candidate city was a factor in the calculation, in the sense that a larger population meant a larger demonstrable effect from the weapon. The potential for maximizing the demonstration of the weapon's capability was a consideration alongside the potential for maximizing military and industrial damage. Kyoto appeared on the early target lists and was removed by Stimson's personal intervention. Stimson had visited Kyoto before the war and regarded it as a city of cultural and historical significance. His objection was not primarily humanitarian in the sense of concern for the population that would be killed. It was primarily concerned with the potential for long-term damage to American relations with Japan if a city of particular cultural importance were destroyed. The distinction is notable. The objection that prevailed was not that the method was wrong, but that a particular target was wrong for reasons that included post-war political calculations. Hiroshima was available. Nagasaki was available. The process continued. The Japanese government's handling of information about the atomic bombings in the days immediately following Hiroshima illustrates a parallel institutional logic operating under extreme conditions. Military officials in Tokyo received initial reports from Hiroshima that were fragmentary and in some cases contradictory, partly because the destruction had been comprehensive enough to disrupt communications. As the nature of the weapon became clearer, Japanese military officials deliberated about whether and how to inform the civilian leadership and the emperor. The information was managed, filtered, and assessed for its implications for the already ongoing internal debate about whether and on what terms Japan might seek to end the war. The atomic bombing was incorporated into an existing institutional process rather than immediately shattering it. The process continued to function. The deliberations continued for several days after Hiroshima and continued through the second bombing of Nagasaki, before the emperor's intervention produced the decision to accept the Allied surrender terms. The Japanese Imperial Army's conduct in the territories it occupied throughout Asia is among the most extensively documented and simultaneously most under-discussed aspects of the war in the Western public memory. The systematic atrocities committed by Japanese forces in China, Korea, the Philippines, and throughout Southeast Asia, including the murder of millions of civilians, the systematic use of sexual slavery, and the conduct of medical experiments on prisoners, are historically documented in considerable detail and are simultaneously absent from the narrative of the war that most Westerners carry. The Nanjing Massacre, which occurred between December 1937 and January 1938, involved the killing of between 100,000 and 300,000 Chinese civilians and prisoners of war over a period of approximately 6 weeks, along with the systematic rape of tens of thousands of women. It was documented at the time by Western observers living in Nanjing, who maintained a safety zone and kept records of what they witnessed. The records survived. The event has never been as thoroughly integrated into the Western understanding of the Second World War as comparable European events, partly because the Western public's frame for the war is primarily European, partly because the political sensitivities of post-war American-Japanese relations made extensive American emphasis on Japanese wartime atrocities institutionally inconvenient for several decades after the war. Unit 731, the Japanese military's biological warfare research unit that operated primarily in Manchuria, conducted experiments on human subjects, primarily Chinese prisoners, that bear direct comparison to the experiments conducted in German concentration camps. The unit conducted experiments on the effects of plague, cholera, typhoid, and other diseases on human subjects, experiments on the effects of cold, experiments on the limits of surgery without anesthesia, experiments on the effects of pressure changes, and large-scale field tests of biological weapons that involved the deliberate infection of Chinese villages and the systematic study of the resulting casualties. The unit's operations killed an estimated 3,000 people in experimental settings and caused the deaths of potentially hundreds of thousands through field deployment of biological agents. After the war, the United States occupation authorities in Japan made a decision about Unit 731 that directly parallels the decisions made about German scientists under Operation Paperclip. The commanders of Unit 731 were not prosecuted at the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunals. They were, instead, granted immunity in exchange for their research data. General Douglas MacArthur personally approved the arrangement. The men who had conducted systematic lethal experiments on prisoners were given immunity and returned to civilian life in Japan, where several of them went on to have prominent careers in medicine, public health administration, and the pharmaceutical industry. The decision was institutionally logical in its own terms. The United States had an interest in the biological warfare data. The data could only be obtained by granting immunity to the men who possessed it. The grant of immunity was made. The data was received. The institutional decision produced a result that diverged from the legal framework that had been simultaneously constructed at Nuremberg to hold other individuals accountable for comparable conduct. The divergence was not incidental. It was the product of separate institutional decisions serving separate institutional interests. The Nuremberg trials themselves were, among other things, an institutional project. They were designed to establish the principle of individual accountability for crimes against humanity and crimes against peace, principles that had not previously been formalized in international law. They were also designed by the victorious powers, and the definition of what constituted a war crime subject to prosecution at Nuremberg was substantially shaped by the conduct of the prosecuting powers. This was noted at the time by the defense, and it has been noted extensively by historians since. The Soviet Union was a co-prosecutor at Nuremberg. Soviet prosecutors introduced evidence of the Katyn massacre, the 1940 killing of approximately 22,000 Polish officers and intellectuals by the Soviet NKVD, as evidence of a German war crime. The attribution to Germany was false, and Soviet officials knew it was false. The actual perpetrators were Soviet, and Soviet officials knew this throughout the Nuremberg proceedings. The false attribution was maintained. It was maintained for decades afterward. The Soviet Union did not officially acknowledge responsibility for Katyn until 1990. The presence of Soviet prosecutors at Nuremberg, applying a legal framework of individual accountability for crimes against humanity while concealing Soviet responsibility for a mass killing that the Soviet government was in the process of falsely attributing to the defendants, is a detail that complicates the institutional narrative of Nuremberg without diminishing the reality of the crimes for which the German defendants were actually accountable. The trial produced outcomes that were, in most cases, legally and historically defensible in terms of the actual guilt of the defendants. It also produced outcomes that were shaped by institutional decisions about which crimes would be examined and which crimes would remain outside the frame. The treatment of Jewish communities by Eastern European populations during the German occupation and the degree to which local collaboration with German anti-Jewish policies extended beyond coercion to active participation and, in some cases, initiative, was extensively documented in some historical records and systematically suppressed in others for decades after the war. In Poland, whose national identity during and after the war was built substantially around the narrative of victimhood and resistance, the documentation of cases in which Polish civilians participated in the killing, persecution, and expropriation of their Jewish neighbors was institutionally suppressed under communist rule and remained a subject of significant political sensitivity after the end of communist rule. The massacre at Jedwabin in July 1941, in which Polish residents of the town killed approximately 300 to 400 of their Jewish neighbors, burning many of them in a barn, occurred without direct German participation. German officials were present, but the killing was organized and carried out by the Polish residents themselves. The event was documented in survivor testimony, in documents produced by the perpetrator's own community, and in German records. But for decades, the official Polish account attributed the killing to the Germans. The revisionist historical work that established the actual events, most prominently by the historian Jan Gross, was published in 2000 and provoked an intense national controversy. The controversy was not primarily about the historical facts, which were by then well documented. It was about the institutional and cultural implications of acknowledging that the national narrative of victimhood needed to accommodate a more complicated reality. Similar suppressions and revisions occurred throughout Eastern Europe. In Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and Ukraine, local participation in the German killing program was extensive and in some cases preceded direct German organizational involvement. In each of these countries, the post-war national narrative was constructed around the frame of Soviet oppression, which was real and severe, in ways that reduced the visibility of collaboration with the prior German occupation. The institutional construction of national memory is a process that operates through decisions made at many levels, and the decisions about what to include and what to omit are rarely made in a single dramatic moment. They are made in the ordinary operation of educational systems, memorial practices, archival policies, and the management of public discourse. The resistance movements that operated in occupied Europe were, in the popular narrative, defined by their opposition to occupation. This is accurate as a general description. The reality of the resistance movements was considerably more complex, and the complexity included internal violence, collaboration with allied intelligence services that had their own interests not always aligned with the interests of the resistance fighters, and post-war consequences for resistance fighters that were often much less straightforward than the narrative of liberation suggests. The French resistance has been the subject of particularly extensive mythologizing, partly because France's post-war national identity required a narrative of widespread resistance to compensate for the reality of the Vichy government's extensive cooperation with German occupation authorities. The actual membership of organized resistance networks during the occupation years was substantially smaller than the post-war commemorative culture implied. The processes by which Vichy officials, collaborators, and participants in the deportation of French Jews were assessed, tried, or exempted from accountability in the post-war period were shaped by political calculations about national unity and the manageability of the post-war state, rather than by consistent application of legal or moral principles. Charles de Gaulle's post-war government made institutional decisions about which aspects of the Vichy period to prosecute and which to allow to recede from public attention. The decisions reflected a calculation that a country which had been thoroughly divided during the occupation could not be reconstructed around a narrative of collective guilt for collaboration. The decision was institutionally pragmatic. It also meant that many individuals who had made specific choices to cooperate with the deportation and killing of French Jews were not held accountable, and that the full extent of Vichy complicity was not thoroughly established in any public legal process during the period when it might have been most fully documented. The British Special Operations Executive, which recruited and trained agents for insertion into occupied Europe, was an institution that sent people into situations with very high probabilities of death or capture. The attrition rate for agents inserted into certain occupied territories was severe. Agents were captured, tortured, and executed. This was an expected outcome. The institution had calculated, correctly in its own terms, that the intelligence value and the disruption to German operations produced by the networks that survived justified the costs paid by the individuals who did not survive. Several of the networks that were captured by German counterintelligence were subsequently run as double-agent operations, with captured agents transmitting messages to London under German control. The messages were designed to appear authentic, while providing either misleading intelligence or facilitating the insertion of further agents who could then also be captured. In some cases, London headquarters was aware that a network had been compromised. In some cases, the institutional process did not successfully identify the compromise, and agents were sent into captured networks. In some documented cases, there were internal indicators that a network was compromised, and those indicators were not acted on in ways that would have prevented further agents from being sent to their deaths. The institutional question of how these failures occurred, whether through genuine failure of analysis or through other factors, including, in some cases, the possibility that London was operating on information it could not reveal without compromising the ultra-decryption program, has never been fully resolved in the public record. The Ultra program, which is the code name for the Allied operation to decrypt German military communications encrypted by the Enigma machine, is now publicly known and extensively documented. During the war, it was one of the most protected secrets held by the Allied governments. The existence of the program was maintained as classified information until the mid-1970s. For 3 decades after the war ended, historical analysis of Allied strategic decisions during the war was conducted without knowledge that Allied commanders had, for most of the war, access to German strategic communications. The implications of this for the historical record are significant. Decisions that appeared, from the post-war historical record, to have been made on the basis of the information that was visibly available to Allied commanders were in fact made with information that was not visible in the record. More significantly for present purposes, the existence of the program required constant institutional decisions about how to act on the information obtained without revealing that it had been obtained. If the Allies acted on decrypted intelligence in ways that were too direct, they risked the Germans concluding that their communications were compromised and changing their encryption methods. This produced documented cases where the decision was made not to act on intelligence that indicated a planned German attack in order to preserve the program. The most discussed of these cases involves the German bombing of Coventry in November 1940, where some historians have argued and others have disputed that British intelligence had advance warning of the raid but could not act on it without revealing the source. Whether or not this specific case involved a decision not to warn Coventry's population, the structural logic it describes was real. The program created a situation in which some information, in order to preserve the capability to obtain more information, could not be used to prevent specific harms. The institutional decision to protect the program was made consistently throughout the war. The harms that may have resulted from that protection are difficult to quantify and have never been fully acknowledged. The experience of the war for the populations of Southeast Asia, who were occupied first by one imperial power and then by another, occupies almost no space in the Western narrative of World War II. The British Empire's relationship with its colonial subjects in India, Burma, Malaya and elsewhere during the war years was defined by a consistent prioritization of imperial interests over the interests of the colonial populations. The Bengal famine of 1943, which killed somewhere between 2 and 3 million people, occurred in territory under British administration. The famine had multiple causes, including the disruption of Bengal's rice trade by the Japanese occupation of Burma, wartime inflation, and administrative failures. It also had contributing causes that are directly attributable to specific British policy decisions. The denial policy, which involved the deliberate destruction or removal of boats, bicycles, and rice stocks in coastal Bengal to prevent them from being used by a potential Japanese invasion, contributed to the disruption of food distribution. Export of rice from India continued through the early phase of the famine. Requests for emergency food imports to India, made by the government of India and by the Viceroy, were refused or delayed by the Churchill government in London. The internal correspondence of the Churchill government regarding the Bengal famine includes statements by Churchill himself that reflect an attitude toward Indian suffering that was, at minimum, one of profound indifference. The requests for food aid were assessed in terms of their effect on shipping capacity available for the war effort in Europe and on the strategic calculus of maintaining Indian cooperation with the imperial war effort. The deaths of millions of people in Bengal were a logistical and political variable in this calculation. The documentation exists. It was produced through normal institutional processes. It has been available to historians for decades and has produced extensive academic discussion without substantially altering the popular understanding of Churchill's wartime role. The experience of colonial soldiers in Allied armies is another dimension of the war that is largely absent from the dominant Western narrative. The British Empire mobilized approximately 2.5 million Indian soldiers, several 100,000 African soldiers, and significant numbers of soldiers from other colonial territories. These soldiers fought in virtually every theater of the war. They fought under command structures that were explicitly organized by race, in which the assumption that non-white soldiers required white officers to lead them was formalized in doctrine and practice. Their pay was lower than that of white soldiers in equivalent positions. Their post-war benefits were substantially less than those provided to white veterans. Their contributions to the outcome of the war were acknowledged in immediate military operational terms and then systematically marginalized in the post-war commemorative culture, which organized its memory of the war primarily around the experiences and sacrifices of soldiers from the white settler nations of the British Empire. The French Empire mobilized significant numbers of African soldiers, the tirailleurs Senegalais, and soldiers from Madagascar, Morocco, Algeria, and other territories, who fought in the campaigns of 1940 and in the liberation of France in 1944 and 1945. Soldiers from colonial territories who participated in the liberation of French cities were in several documented cases ordered to leave before victory celebrations and public ceremonies so that the imagery of liberation would present a white France being liberated by white soldiers. This instruction was given through official channels. It was communicated as a military order. The soldiers who received it complied. The racial organization of the American military during the war is better documented in American historical memory than the comparable practices of the British and French empires, but the documentation has not consistently produced an accurate assessment of its implications. Black American soldiers served in segregated units, under white officers in most cases, with restricted access to the full range of military occupational specialties, and with systematic exposure to a military culture that mirrored and in some cases intensified the racial hierarchy of American civilian society. In the occupation zones in Europe and the Pacific, the racial hierarchy of the American military was enforced by military police and by formal regulations that governed access to facilities, entertainment, and rest areas. The irony of black American soldiers fighting in a segregated army against a regime whose ideology included the explicit subordination of non-white peoples was not lost on black Americans at the time and produced the Double V campaign, the demand for victory against fascism abroad and victory against racism at home. The Double V campaign was monitored by the FBI under J. Edgar Hoover, who assessed black newspapers that promoted it as potential threats to national security and wartime morale. The institutional security apparatus assessed the demand for equal treatment as a security concern. The experience of Japanese-American civilians who were removed from their homes and placed in internment camps following the attack on Pearl Harbor is better known within American historical consciousness than most of the other suppressed realities examined in this account. The internment of approximately 120,000 people, the majority of whom were American citizens, on the basis of their ancestry, was authorized by executive order, reviewed by the Supreme Court, and implemented through the normal machinery of the federal government with considerable organizational efficiency. The farms, businesses, homes, and other property of the internees were, in most cases, lost during the period of internment. The community that was economically established on the West Coast before the war was economically destroyed by its removal. The legal basis for the internment was challenged in the courts and was upheld by the Supreme Court in Korematsu v. United States in 1944, in a decision that has since been recognized as one of the most significant failures of the American judicial system to constrain the executive power during wartime. The decision was formally repudiated by the Supreme Court in 2018, 74 years after it was issued. The repudiation was symbolic in nature, as there were no living consequences to be addressed. The institutional logic that produced the original decision, the logic that security assessments made by the executive branch during wartime are entitled to deference even when they produce systematic violations of the constitutional rights of citizens, was not structurally altered by the repudiation. The war crimes trials conducted after the war, at Nuremberg for German defendants and in Tokyo for Japanese defendants, established the principle that individuals could be held criminally accountable for crimes against humanity, regardless of orders received from superiors, and regardless of whether the acts in question violated the domestic law of the state in whose service they were committed. This was a genuine legal development, however imperfect its application. It was also an institutional product of the victorious powers, and the scope of accountability it established was carefully bounded. The German industrialists who had used concentration camp labor were prosecuted at the subsequent Nuremberg trials. The series of 12 trials conducted by American military tribunals after the main Nuremberg trial. Some received sentences. Several received early release in the early 1950s as Cold War political considerations shifted the American assessment of the desirability of maintaining German industrialists in prison. Alfred Krupp, whose family company had used slave labor extensively, was released in 1951 and had his personal fortune restored to him. His corporate empire was rebuilt. It operated as a normal industrial enterprise in the Federal Republic of Germany for decades afterward. The denazification process that was intended to systematically identify and remove from positions of authority individuals who had participated in or supported the Nazi regime was implemented with varying degrees of rigor in the different Allied occupation zones and was progressively abandoned as the political priorities of the occupation shifted toward rebuilding West Germany as a stable, non-communist state. The administrative apparatus of the West German state was, by the mid-1950s, staffed at many levels by individuals who had served in equivalent positions under the Nazi government, not because their prior service was unknown, but because the institutional judgment had been made that administrative continuity was more important than administrative accountability. The Federal Republic's intelligence service, the Bundesnachrichtendienst, was largely built on the organizational skeleton of a wartime German military intelligence network run by Reinhard Gehlen, whose organization had operated primarily against the Soviet Union on the Eastern Front. After the war, Gehlen's organization was preserved and supported first by the American occupation authorities and then by the CIA. Because its accumulated intelligence on the Soviet Union was assessed as valuable in the emerging Cold War competition. The organization that became West Germany's primary intelligence service was, at its founding, staffed with individuals whose prior service had been in a military intelligence network that had operated in a context of extreme brutality on the Eastern Front. The transition was managed institutionally. The prior service was assessed as relevant experience. The Eastern Front of the war, The conflict between Germany and the Soviet Union, that was by most measures the central and most destructive theater of the entire war, is substantially less present in the Western public memory of World War II than the Western Front. The asymmetry is itself historically significant. Approximately 70 to 80% of all German military casualties were suffered on the Eastern Front. The majority of the civilian deaths of the war, the majority of the systematic killing programs, and the majority of the physical destruction occurred on the Eastern Front and in the territories through which it passed. The Western public memory of the war is organized primarily around events, campaigns, and theaters that constitute a substantial minority of the war's total human cost. This asymmetry is partly an artifact of access to sources. Western historians had extensive access to Western Allied records and, after Nuremberg, to substantial portions of captured German records. Soviet archives were largely inaccessible until the partial opening that followed the end of the Soviet Union in 1991, and the partial opening has not produced full transparency. But the asymmetry is also a product of institutional decisions about which history to tell. The Cold War created a context in which extensive Western engagement with the history of the Eastern Front, which was primarily Soviet history in terms of whose soldiers did most of the fighting and dying, was institutionally awkward. Telling the story of the Eastern Front accurately required acknowledging the scale and significance of the Soviet military contribution to the defeat of Germany, and acknowledging that contribution had implications for the political competition between the Western powers and the Soviet Union that officials on both sides preferred to manage carefully. The systematic killing of Soviet civilians in the occupied territories of the Soviet Union by German forces and by German-organized or German-directed auxiliary units drawn from local populations was conducted at a scale that is difficult to convey. In the 3 years of German occupation of Soviet territory, approximately 17 million Soviet civilians were killed through shooting, starvation, forced labor, the deliberate destruction of villages, and the systematic application of German policies that designated the Slavic population of occupied Soviet territory as racially inferior and economically exploitable to the point of consumption. The word Untermenschen, subhumans, appears repeatedly in German administrative documents relating to the civilian population of occupied Soviet territory. It was not primarily a rhetorical expression. It was a policy category that had operational implications for how those populations would be administered, fed, and treated. The Hunger Plan, developed in 1941 by Herbert Back of the German Ministry of Food and Agriculture, was an explicit policy document that projected the starvation of tens of millions of people in occupied Soviet territory as a consequence of, and in some respects a goal of, German occupation policy. The plan recognized that diverting Soviet food production to feed the German military and the German population would result in mass starvation among Soviet civilians. This consequence was recognized as acceptable in the planning documents. The plan was implemented. The starvation occurred. The numbers involved are among the largest of any single policy consequence in the history of the war. The partisan war that developed in occupied Soviet territory, and the German response to it, produced some of the most systematically documented atrocities of the Eastern Front. German anti-partisan doctrine authorized, and in practice required, the killing of civilians in proportions far exceeding any defensible interpretation of anti-partisan necessity. The ratios used varied by command and over time, but documents established that German units in the East were operating under standing orders that authorized the execution of dozens or hundreds of civilians for every German soldier killed by partisan action. These orders were issued through normal command channels. They were received and implemented by units whose commanders did not, for the most part, subsequently face accountability for their implementation. The civilian killing in the occupied Soviet territories was carried out by multiple institutional actors. The SS and SD had primary organizational responsibility for the systematic elements of the killing program, including the mobile killing units known as Einsatzgruppen that followed behind the German advance and killed Jewish communities and Soviet political officials. But the regular German army, the Wehrmacht, was also deeply involved in the process. The questions of extent and systematic nature of Wehrmacht involvement in atrocities were contested in post-war Germany for decades, and the institutional position of the Federal Republic's military and government was, for much of the post-war period, that the Wehrmacht had fought a normal military war, and that atrocities had been committed primarily by the SS. This position was institutionally convenient and was not historically accurate. The Wehrmacht War Crimes exhibition that toured German cities in the 1990s, presenting documentary evidence of Wehrmacht involvement in atrocities in the East, produced an intense and significant public controversy precisely because it challenged an institutional position about the nature of German military conduct that had been maintained for decades. The evidence it presented was not new to historians. It was new to a substantial portion of the German public, because the institutional decisions made in the post-war decades about what to include in public historical memory had not included this dimension of the Wehrmacht's wartime conduct. The war at sea produced its own institutional suppressions. The German submarine campaign against Allied shipping, at its height between 1940 and 1943, came closer to severing the supply lines that kept Britain in the war than any other German military operation. The campaign killed approximately 30,000 Allied merchant sailors, men who were not military combatants in the formal sense, but who were essential to the Allied war effort and who died at a rate that, in proportional terms, relative to the size of the merchant marine, was one of the highest of any category of participant in the war. The treatment of survivors of torpedo attacks by German submarines was itself a subject of policy debate and practice that is not well integrated into the popular understanding of submarine warfare. In the North Atlantic, where water temperatures were such that survival time for men in the water was extremely limited, the question of whether a submarine that had just sunk a ship was obligated to remain in the area to rescue survivors at substantial risk to the submarine and its crew was both a humanitarian question and a practical military question. German submarine commanders operated under standing orders that discouraged rescue, and the Laconia incident in 1942, in which a German submarine that had begun attempting to rescue survivors of a ship it had sunk was attacked by an American aircraft, was used by Admiral Dönitz to justify issuing an explicit order forbidding rescue attempts. This order, the Laconia Order, was cited at Nuremberg as evidence of a criminal policy. The Allied practice of attacking submarines attempting rescue operations was not examined with equivalent scrutiny at Nuremberg. The collaboration between neutral nations and the German state has been another area where post-war institutional decisions about memory shaped public understanding for decades. Switzerland, Sweden, Spain, and Portugal all maintained economic relationships with Germany during the war that were substantially more beneficial to the German war effort than the term neutrality might suggest. Swiss banks accepted and processed German gold, including gold that had been extracted from the victims of the killing program, as a normal banking activity throughout the war. The Swiss National Bank and Swiss private banks were aware to varying degrees of the provenance of the gold they were receiving. The institutional decisions were made at the level of banking policy and national economic management. They were framed as the requirements of neutrality in a difficult wartime situation. The extent of Swiss institutional engagement with German assets, including assets extracted from victims of the Holocaust, was not publicly investigated in Switzerland in the immediate post-war period. Investigations conducted in the 1990s, partly in response to American political pressure, documented the extent of the engagement in considerable detail. The documentation existed in bank and government archives. It had been accessible in principle to researchers who were permitted access to the archives. The institutional decisions about what access to grant had shaped what was publicly known for half a century after the events. The same pattern applies with variations to Sweden, whose iron ore exports to Germany were significant to the German war industry, and to Spain, whose government maintained a relationship with Germany that went considerably beyond strategic neutrality. The Spanish government provided naval intelligence to Germany, facilitated the transit of German agents, and sent a volunteer division, the Division Azul, to fight alongside German forces on the Eastern Front. The post-war institutional framing of Spain's role as one of neutral self-preservation, maintained for Cold War political reasons because Franco's Spain was a useful partner in the containment of Soviet influence, was more convenient than accurate. The Vatican's conduct during the war has been the subject of sustained historical and moral debate, focused primarily on the question of what Pius XII knew about the Holocaust, when he knew it, and what, if anything, the institutional Catholic Church could have done or chose not to do. The debate is complicated by the partial opening of Vatican archives in recent years, which has produced new evidence without resolving the fundamental questions about institutional decision-making. What is clear from the available documentation is that the Vatican received substantial information about the killing of Jews in occupied Europe from multiple sources, including from German Catholic bishops and from diplomats. What the Vatican chose to do with this information institutionally was to communicate through private diplomatic channels rather than through public condemnation, on the basis of assessments that public condemnation would provoke German retaliation against Catholics in occupied territories and might not alter German policy. Whether this institutional calculation was correct as a practical assessment, whether the lives of Catholics in occupied territories would have been endangered by a more explicit papal condemnation of the killing of Jews, whether such a condemnation might have altered the behavior of Catholic soldiers and officials participating in the killing, are questions on which historians disagree. What is documentable is the institutional process by which the decisions were made, the assessments of competing interests, the calibration of risks, and the choices about which harms to prioritize and which to accept. The post-war treatment of Nazi gold and looted assets, beyond the specific Swiss context, involved institutional decisions made by every major Allied power. The Tripartite Gold Commission, established to manage the restitution of gold looted by Germany from occupied national central banks, was an Allied institutional creation that operated for decades. The restitution process was complicated and in many cases incomplete. Assets that had been looted from individuals rather than from national institutions, including the personal assets of Jewish victims of the Holocaust, were handled through a separate process that was significantly less well organized and that produced far less complete restitution. The institutional distinction between national assets and individual assets, which determined which category of victim received priority attention in the restitution process, was not a neutral administrative choice. It reflected a hierarchy of institutional interests. The question of German reparations to Israel and to individual Jewish survivors was resolved through a specific agreement, the Luxembourg Agreement of 1952, negotiated between West Germany, Israel, and the Conference on Jewish Material Claims Against Germany. The agreement produced substantial payments and was, from one perspective, an institutional acknowledgement of responsibility. It was also, from another perspective, an institutional mechanism through which the Federal Republic of Germany was able to establish its international legitimacy and facilitate its reintegration into the Western community of nations at a time when its reintegration was strategically important to the United States and the Western European powers. The moral and the strategic were once again aligned in ways that served institutional interests on multiple sides. The children who were separated from their families in the course of the war's displacement and killing programs, and who were placed in institutional care, adopted into families, or incorporated into programs designed to Germanize suitable children from occupied Slavic territories, represent one of the war's most direct human legacies. The Lebensborn program, through which the SS organized the care of children considered racially suitable for incorporation into the German population, including children taken from occupied Poland and other Slavic territories whose appearance met the program's racial criteria, produced a population of individuals whose origins were systematically obscured in institutional records. After the war, many of these individuals did not know that they had been taken from their original families as small children. The records of their origins were distributed across multiple institutional archives, were in some cases deliberately obscured, and were in many cases inaccessible in archives that were located in different countries, in some cases in archives that did not become accessible until decades after the war. The individuals affected were numerous. Estimates range from tens of thousands to several 100,000, and the institutional task of identifying them and, where possible, connecting them with their origins or with surviving family members was undertaken, where it was undertaken at all, sporadically and without comprehensive institutional organization. The Soviet Army's conduct in Germany in the final months of the war and in the occupation period that followed has been documented in considerable detail in both Soviet and German sources, and the documentation presents a picture of systematic violence against the civilian population of the territories through which Soviet forces advanced. The scale of the sexual violence in particular is documented in historical research using demographic records, hospital records, and survivor accounts. The institutional response of Soviet military command to this violence was, in most cases, to treat it as an acceptable consequence of the advance rather than as a disciplinary or criminal problem to be addressed. Individual Soviet officers who attempted to restrain their soldiers were in some cases court-martialed for undermining morale. The institutional tolerance for the violence was not unlimited and did vary over time and by command, but the documentary record indicates that it was treated primarily as a management problem rather than a criminal one. The Allied occupation of Japan produced its own institutional decisions about what to document, what to prosecute, and what to allow to recede. The decision to maintain the imperial institution, to retain the emperor and protect him from prosecution despite the evidence of his involvement in wartime decision-making, was made at the highest levels of the American occupation administration and reflected a calculation that institutional continuity, provided by the emperor's authority, was essential to the management of a successful occupation. The immunity of the emperor was absolute and was never subjected to the kind of legal scrutiny that was applied to other Japanese wartime leaders. It was an institutional decision made before the legal processes began, and the legal processes were shaped to conform to it. The prisoners of war held in Japanese camps, including American, British, Dutch, Australian, and other Allied prisoners, experienced conditions that were, in general, substantially worse than the conditions experienced by prisoners held by Germany in the Western theaters of the war. The mortality rate among American prisoners held by Japan was approximately 40%, compared to approximately 1% for American prisoners held by Germany in the Western European theater. The treatment of Allied prisoners by Japan was a subject of extensive documentation at the Tokyo war crimes trials. It was also a subject of institutional management in the post-war period, as the American decision to maintain Japan as a close Cold War ally created political incentives to not make the wartime treatment of Allied prisoners a continuing point of official emphasis in the bilateral relationship. Veterans of Japanese prisoner of war camps in the United States, Britain, and Australia, who sought to continue legal claims against Japanese companies that had used their labor, found their claims obstructed by the legal frameworks of the peace treaty signed with Japan in 1951, which was constructed in ways that waived most individual claims in exchange for the broader settlement. The institutional decision to settle at the national level, which served the diplomatic and strategic interests of the United States and Japan, had consequences for the individuals whose specific harms were waived as part of the settlement. The long occupation of the Pacific Islands by Japanese forces and the experience of the Pacific Island populations under that occupation has been almost entirely absent from the Western narrative of the war. The populations of the Pacific Islands under Japanese occupation, in Micronesia, in the Philippines, in the Dutch East Indies and elsewhere, experienced the occupation in ways that were substantially shaped by Japanese racial and colonial ideology, and the conduct of Japanese forces toward these populations varied from territory to territory and over time, but included systematic exploitation, forced labor, violent enforcement of occupation rules, and in some cases mass killings of civilian populations in the context of military operations. The experience of the war for the Chinese population continued throughout the period that Western accounts treat as the Second World War, since China had been at war with Japan since 1937 and the conflict in China was continuous through 1945. The total Chinese casualties of the war, military and civilian, are estimated at somewhere between 15 and 20 million, a figure that substantially exceeds the total casualties of any Western European country, and that is larger than the total military casualties of the United States, Britain, and France combined. The Chinese experience of the war is, in Western public memory, treated as peripheral to the main event, as context for the Pacific theater rather than as a central dimension of the global conflict. The partition of Korea, which occurred as a consequence of the division of Japanese occupation responsibilities between the Soviet Union and the United States in the final days of the war, was an institutional decision made under time pressure at the end of a conflict that had not included any serious planning for Korea's post-war status. The line drawn at the 38th parallel was, in the original understanding of both sides, a temporary administrative division rather than a political or territorial one. The institutional dynamics of the emerging Cold War transformed what had been conceived as a temporary arrangement into the division that defined Korean history for the remainder of the 20th century and beyond. The populations of Korea had no institutional role in the decision that determined their national fate. The decision was made by officials in Washington and Moscow, working from maps. The atomic bomb tests conducted by the United States and other nuclear powers in the Pacific in the post-war years involved the deliberate use of Pacific Island populations as study subjects for the effects of nuclear weapons and nuclear fallout. The inhabitants of Bikini Atoll and the Marshall Islands were relocated from their home atoll to allow nuclear testing to proceed and were told by American officials that they would be able to return after the tests. They have not been able to return permanently. The contamination of Bikini Atoll and the surrounding area with radioactive material from the tests remains at levels that preclude permanent habitation. The displacement was managed institutionally. The displaced population was, from the institutional perspective, an administrative consequence of a military research program. The people of Rongelap Atoll were exposed to significant radioactive fallout from a 1954 nuclear test, Bravo, which was substantially more powerful than the scientists who designed it had predicted. The Marshallese who lived on Rongelap were not evacuated before the test, and the fallout from the unexpectedly large explosion covered the atoll with radioactive ash. The population developed radiation sickness and was evacuated 2 days after the event. Studies of the radiation exposure and its health consequences were subsequently conducted by American medical researchers who used the Marshallese population as a study group for the long-term health effects of radiation exposure. The relationship between the research subjects and the researchers was not fully one of informed consent in the sense that the term implies. The research was conducted through institutional processes that were approved at administrative levels within the American Atomic Energy Commission. The Cold War was already underway before the Second World War formally ended. The institutional divisions and competitions that would define the next 4 decades were being established in the final months of the fighting, in decisions about where armies would be positioned at the end of the war, in the negotiations at Yalta and Potsdam about the post-war political order, and in the intelligence operations being conducted by the former Allies against each other in the territories that were simultaneously being liberated and occupied. The systems that the war had built, the surveillance infrastructure, the weapons development programs, the intelligence networks, the propaganda apparatus, the institutional capacity for managing populations under emergency conditions did not dissolve with the armistices and the surrender ceremonies. They were inherited, modified, and redirected. The individuals who had operated those systems in many cases continued to operate them in new institutional contexts, serving new institutional purposes. The procedures continued. The forms continued to be filled out. The files continued to be maintained. What the end of the war resolved, formally, was the question of which states would exercise authority over which territories. The formal sovereignty questions were settled, at least provisionally, through the instruments of surrender, the peace treaties, and the occupation arrangements. What the end of the war did not resolve was the institutional logic by which the war had been conducted. The capacity for systematic violence, organized through institutional processes, authorized through chains of command, documented in meticulous records, and sustained by the procedural compliance of individuals who performed their assigned functions within the system. That capacity did not end with the war. It was absorbed into the institutional structures of the post-war world and continued to operate within them. The German state that signed the Instrument of Surrender in May 1945 ceased to exist as a legal entity. The institutions that had populated that state, the ministries, the courts, the police, the administrative agencies, the corporate structures, the financial institutions, continued in various forms, staffed by varying proportions of the individuals who had staffed them under the previous institutional arrangement. The Federal Republic of Germany that emerged from the Western occupation zones was a new legal entity. It was also, in many of its institutional dimensions, a continuation. The victory that was declared in 1945 was real, in the sense that the regimes that had initiated the most systematic programs of conquest and killing were defeated and destroyed. It was less complete in the sense that the institutional conditions that had enabled those programs, the capacity to organize large-scale violence through bureaucratic means, the willingness of institutional actors to subordinate moral considerations to procedural compliance, the tendency of institutional memory to manage its own past in ways that served present institutional interests. These conditions were not defeated with the regimes that had most visibly manifested them. They remained, distributed across the institutional landscape of the post-war world, available to be activated by whatever institutional imperatives would come next. The files from the war are still being opened. The archives are still being processed. Documents that were classified at the end of the war remain classified in some national archives. Decisions that were made in the name of the populations of the combatant nations, decisions that those populations were not informed of at the time, have in some cases still not been formally acknowledged. The institutional management of the war's history has been an ongoing process for 8 decades, and it continues. New documents become available. New assessments are made. The institutional decisions about what to release, what to acknowledge, and what to continue to hold are made through the same procedural processes that made the original decisions. The war ended. The systems that administered it did not.